Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the Avril Lavigne music video Skater Boy. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying GCSE OCR Media Studies, as it is one of the current optional music videos for study. The music video for Skater Boy will only ever come up as a media language, representation or audience question. So I'm going to go through all of those aspects in this video as I go through Skater Boy. The beginning of the video establishes the urban setting in the video. So you get lots of diegetic sound from a kind of city-based environments, lots of shots of cars, you've got graffiti. It adds to this kind of quite young, urban, rebellious vibe. And you see people dropping in via rope, which is quite extreme, quite adrenaline filled. It might make, represent them as being quite sporty and makes it seem quite exciting. And again, quite rebellious and different, which is going to appeal to their kind of main teenage target audience at the time. We then see a bedroom which has very typical signifiers of being a teenage bedroom. So it's quite messy. We see the teenagers using technology such as Messenger. We see a Motorola pager and the use of these kind of technologies, which were very current at the time that Skater Boy came out. It reflects that context. It reflects the time period in which it came out. And it also would have appealed to teenagers who would have found this really familiar at the time. These were technologies that young people were using all the time and would have been seen as the height of technology to people watching the video back in the 90s. There's lots of fast-paced editing happening here, lots of very short takes, creates quite an exciting feel to it. So we see they're going down through the manhole cover, there's rule breaking, people going underground. It definitely feels very rebellious, so people breaking the law, breaking rules. And that's very definitely the kind of narrative and theme and representation that Avril Lavigne was giving off in a lot of her videos at the time. When we first see Avril Lavigne, she kind of jumps into the shot, makes her seem quite energetic and bold. And we see her dressed in very typically kind of casual clothes. A lot of the time in music videos, women are often kind of objectified, sexualized and seen in a lot more glamorous clothes, whereas she's kind of wearing what would be considered more kind of skate culture clothes at the time. So quite casual, but quite bold and kind of punky, which really created this representation of her as being a bit different, a bit quirky, a bit unusual, and not your kind of typical female star. Having said that, they do use some quite simple gender stereotypes within the video. So we kind of see this idea of a boy and a girl. They use binary opposites. So this idea that he's a kind of a musician and she's a ballet dancer. So there's some kind of stereotypes and binary opposition that goes on between these two kind of characters within the narrative. And those simple stereotypes often make a narrative easy to understand for audiences, particularly young audiences. There's a lot of chaos at this part of the music video. The people throwing things in the air, pushing past people. Again, it adds to this rebellious nature that she's not abiding by the rules and she doesn't really care about other people and their feelings. She's got a tie around her neck. Now, these little skinny ties, very fashionable in this time period. I don't think I ever owned one, but I definitely had friends that had these little ties. It almost connotes like being a schoolgirl, which, that can add an element of sexualization for a lot of people because you often get adult women dressed as schoolgirls for male audiences. But the fact that the tie is worn around her neck, not with the proper school uniform, and it's kind of flung over the side, again, it's this idea of rule breaking and not necessarily following the regulations of school uniform. She's biking down the corridor in school. Again, she's such a rule breaker, so wild. It's this idea that she's not a good girl. She's somebody that she's perhaps one of the naughtier kids. And that would have appealed to a lot of audiences who perhaps might have wanted to break the rules in their own lives. But even if they didn't, it's that idea of an escapist aspirational lifestyle. They wish they could have been like Avril Lavigne. The walls are quite dingy, the setting is quite grotty, flaked paint on the walls and crumbling plaster and things. It's quite grungy, and grunge was quite a big influence, grunge punk, quite big influences in this time period. There's a lot of jumping on cars here. Gosh, these people break so many rules. It's not funny. So yeah, she's rebellious. She's naughty, jumping on cars, very much representing teenagers in general as being quite rebellious. That's quite a conventional representation of teenagers in the media. And we see her in a car, she's not wearing a seatbelt, and there's so many of them in there. Oh, again, so many rules broken, very naughty. You know, adding to this representation of her being a bit of a rebel and not somebody who conforms. Lots of sort of sports, you know, extreme sports here, like BMX biking, skating, that kind of thing, kind of urban sports that would appeal to young teenagers. And very much that were kind of popular at the time amongst the kind of skater punk communities. And that's when we see, again, a lot more singing on top of cars, this kind of illegal party vibe, you know, setting up speakers in the street and plugging in cables, throwing things off of buildings. So, you know, wild party and very much disturbing the kind of the neighbourhood. The crowd around Avril signifies that she's popular and successful because they're all crowded around her watching and cheering while she's singing. You've got a sign in the background that says "Do not block." Oh, they're blocking it. Again, it's this idea that they are rule breakers. So you're even seeing very clear signifiers that they're not listening or paying any attention to the rules. There's lots of close-up on the musicians and the instruments at this point, and that is because potentially in this kind of punky subgenre, the emphasis is very much more on musical talent and musical skill, whereas in a lot of more conventional kind of pop genre music videos, a lot of artists can't play their own instruments. So whereas within this genre there is that focus on look, we can actually play our guitars and we can play the drums, and that would appeal to a lot of people who perhaps are really interested in the skill of the musicians. It represents them as having a lot of know-how and being successful. Lots of close-ups on Avril Lavigne's face here. Close-ups of music artists are a great way of selling the artist to the audience. The direct gaze to the camera speaks straight to us, makes her seem quite bold and powerful. And she's very emotional, like aggressive in her facial expressions, the way she screws up her face and screams a lot of the words. So the kind of mise-en-scene, the body language is again creating this idea that she's a rule breaker and she's dominant and aggressive. She uses this kind of hand symbol, which has become a symbolic code for kind of rock music and musicians over the last kind of, 50, 60 years. It would be familiar to a lot of audiences as something that you would do to show that you're really into music and that you're kind of having a great time at a party. Lots of low angles of her as well create this idea of dominance and power. A police car with flashing lights. Look how naughty she is. The police have got involved. So the police car, again, connotes this idea that she's a rule breaker. She's breaking the law as well. And that adds this idea of kind of danger element to her, which a lot of target audiences might have enjoyed. And this is where we get quite a wild scene of a lot of rule breaking. Gosh, they're so naughty. So we see the camera, people knocked to the floor. There's a low angle of a camera of like people being crushed. There's a montage of people smashing windscreens. There's a girl arrested. Someone swings and smashes a guitar. So very much this idea of aggression and violence and elements that might be more familiar to audiences who are fans of that kind of punk rock hybrid genre. We again get more sirens and we get helicopter as well, which adds to this idea that she's doing something crazy. And this is where we see a low angle of Avril Lavigne with a kind of halo of light around her, lighting her up as though she's some kind of, all-powerful angel goddess. Makes her seem quite important and special. So they've used a lot of real locations, naturalistic costumes, and this creates this element of realism. Realism is something that is quite common within these kind of punk rock hybrid genres. Having said that, obviously having a massive party in the street with people all crowded around jumping on cars, perhaps not so realistic, but certainly the settings and the costumes adding to this idea of, she's not trying to represent herself as like a glamorous superstar. It's more representing herself as like an everyday rebel. It creates this idea that Avril Lavigne is part of a community that is alternative, that is not mainstream. They are the rule breakers. They are, the punks. They are the naughty kids. And so she's not part of the mainstream popular crowds. And a lot of teenagers feel like this sometimes as well. And that might engage them. They feel like they understand Avril and they feel like they understand her kind of aggression. It's quite cathartic, screamy music. And a lot of teenagers quite like that as well. the narrative elements of the kind of boy-girl falling in love, it kind of reinforces that like a heteronormative representation of sexuality, which I guess is, you know, it's a mainstream representation of sexuality. It's, you know, although she's trying to be alternative and quirky, I suppose back then in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, it was still quite conventional to be heteronormative in terms of representing relationships, and she wanted to probably seem quirky and alternative whilst also remaining somewhat mainstream to make money. So it kind of makes sense as to why they've done this, but yeah, certainly reinforcing stereotypical ideas of gender and sexuality for the most part. It's mostly white as well, which is quite unusual considering they're in a very populated area. You know, cities and towns do tend to be more ethnically diverse than kind of more rural areas. And being in a sort of urban area like that, having a mostly white cast does seem quite unusual. It might represent the fact that, you know, music videos have often in the past been, you know, predominantly white focused and have often excluded ethnic minorities from the casts. So that was my easy to understand guide to Skater Boy by Avril Lavigne. Hopefully you found it useful. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and I'm adding a lot of videos relevant to both AQA, OCR and Educas over the next few months. And if there's a particular video you would like that I don't already have, you can leave a little comment below and I'll do what I can.